Hi guys, I'm just getting back into the hang of YouTube. So right now I'm currently in my dorm at Oxford University. I'm studying abroad here and it's been a really hectic move-in period. So I'm sorry that I've taken a little bit of a break from my channel, but I thought I'd really quickly film the intro to the video that you are about to see, 10 books that changed my life, part 2, since coming to college. I am an English major and books are super meaningful and significant to me. I engage with them academically and also outside of the classroom in my personal life, and I wanted to just talk about books that enriched my life and my perspective. So I really hope that you enjoy the video. Please like and subscribe. I will have tons of college related and study abroad related content coming up. I filmed my move-in and I'll have days in the life, dorm tours once I get everything settled. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Today I present to you 10 books that have changed my life for the better, for the worse, and a lot of them have a huge story behind them. So the next book isn't necessarily one of my favorite books, but it definitely left a lasting impact on my life, and it is the Iliad. This is not to say in the slightest that you need to read the Iliad. Just such an experience that is so hyped up for you. It is the origin of literally the entire Western canon. As an English major, you were taught that this is the creed of all literature, which was obviously built on the myth of what is Western civilization. That's tricky, and the oppression of certain voices, but we don't have to get into that. So yeah, it was so hyped up for me. How could it not leave a lasting impact, whether it met those standards or didn't meet them? And what I will say is this is the book that I probably had the most academic relationship to, in the fact that I definitely had to mine it for almost like gold, and just how arbitrary, English felt after I read this book. It's one of those things where you think you'll encounter it, and that if there could be an element of perfection, it would be this book. And you realize, my favorite thing to say is like, all my teachers are like, the crow is so important. And I'm like, what if Homer just fucking liked a crow and decided he wanted a crow in his novel? Now it's like the sign for everything everywhere. That's just how I feel about the entire book. Homer, he had a good time. He probably laid back in his little, hut, or it probably wasn't a hut, some old empire, and was like, whatever, sipping his whatever, and like, what do we write about today? Ah, yes, this is what I want to write about Zeus. It shall last forever. Homer seemed like a more chill guy than I thought he would be. Is he even aware that he's Homer? People say once you read him, you can't unsee him, and it's kind of true. Once you read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and really, really old literature that has been taught, I think that's the part that matters. It's not that this book is great. It's that every writer who comes after him has read him. So obviously he is sort of the headcanon, the universal headcanon. As a writer, it's extremely important to know that, and as a reader too, it's so important to know what is a reference to what. The way that Homer writes stories, not just in this book, but later on, and even getting to read Ovid's Metamorphosis and the Illiad, and like super crux of society books, they are really the ones who hold the keys for how stories develop and how they advance. Every book since then is, if not a ripoff, then like a derivation of these books. And that's not to say that this book is that great, and I think that is the empowering part. It's not even a book that has the power to shape us. It's the power of a book to be carried, to almost be tied to like a heritage or birthright or a national or, hemispherical, I guess, identity. It's not good, obviously. I have my own problems with Western tradition, but we live in it. I think in order to write unconventional, you have to understand convention, and what is more conventional than this? And this I read my second half of freshman year. It's called Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong. This book really surprised me, and it's my only Asian American author, and it's not my favorite Asian American book, but really what this entire video is about is how books intersect with my personal life. During my freshman year, I had to read a lot of books. I was in a full year-long introductory English class. I was also taking writing classes, and I really didn't have time to read for fun. So I really wasn't exploring books. My life felt extremely dictated by other people. I used to read and write on my own terms, but I was pulling insane hours working for the school newspaper. It really hit a breaking point. Not only was I living unsustainably on very cheap fast food, but I was also enduring a lot of psychological stuff. I just moved alone into New York City. The city saw a rise to the amount of, I believe, believe 400% of increased Asian American hate crime. People being followed, shootings, a woman being followed to her house and shot, a woman later on being pushed into the subway, the death of those women at the massage parlor in Chinatown, and a sense of real threat and real violence. You know, I was in school. They would tell me the books that they thought were necessary, but I had to add this to my syllabus, not out of want, but a feeling of necessity. I would go online and I would feel deeply traumatized by the things that I saw, and it got to the point where I never wanted to leave my apartment. I found a real sense of solace in this book, and it was recommended to me while I was working on a story for the school newspaper, which was really hard for me, writing about Asian American hate crime. Put, you know, a sample of what that article was like over here. It was disturbing to talk to people not on the news and not on my phone who I don't know, but people who go to my school, people who walk the same streets, and saying that they were chased, that they were followed, that they were spit on, pushed, shoved, called names. I booked a flight home because I felt that unsafe. The problem was so immediate. This book was really necessary for me. This, in conjunction with having to sit in on a lecture for that story, helped me see that this wasn't a random occurrence, a random plot point of Asian American hate crimes. It comes from a long history that in past global pandemics, Asians were often pitted as the carriers of disease. This book, it was the first time that I had ever learned about Asian American lynching. You know, in the past, I had experienced racism more verbally and less intrusively. It was never something that felt like a threat to my safety or my sense of self, my sense of space. This book really helped me work through that. It helped me understand that what I was experiencing was real, that it was valid, that it has a backstory, and that the notion of the American dream and who we see ourselves as is founded on Asian American racism. I'll just read this very short passage. Minor feelings occur when American optimism is enforced upon you, which contradicts your own racialized reality, thereby creating a static and cognitive dissonance. You are told things are so much better while you think things are the same. You are told Asian Americans are so successful while you feel like a failure. This optimism sets up false expectations that increase these feelings of dysphoria. Minor feelings are also the emotions we're accused of having when we decide to be difficult. In other words, when we decide to be honest. When minor feelings are finally externalized, they are interpreted as hostile, ungrateful, jealous, depressing, and belligerent. Effects ascribed to racialized behavior that whites consider out of line. Our feelings are overreactions because our lived experiences and structural inequity are not commensurate with their diluted reality. It was great to sort of step outside of academic readings, being told that there were solutions to problems or that our thoughts had to be rational, our approaches streamlined, and to really validate myself, the irrational emotions. I felt very Asian American. I felt very proud of where I come from and who I am. And I also felt a sense of community. The Asian American struggle is collective. It's a struggle that we as a community can talk about and deal with and address and mourn together and celebrate our identities together. And it definitely helped me understand the world better and myself better. The next book that we will talk about is Frankenstein. Not my favorite book, just extremely influential. So I read this twice, once my senior year of high school, and it was really depressing at that time. Mary Shelley, when she wrote it, it had experienced the death of her husband and son and I think father. And I definitely didn't understand that type of pain. I still obviously don't understand that type of pain, but I was a lot more distant from it my senior year of high school. And then I took a class that will forever change my life the summer after my freshman year of college. It was called Paradise Lost. It was about this book, Frankenstein, and Paradise Lost by John Milton, and Paradise by Toni Morrison, because this book and Toni Morrison's book were spin-offs of Paradise Lost. It was a hard time for me. My freshman year was incredibly difficult for me with the pandemic. I remember hitting a very, very, very strong breaking point, and I really didn't want to take this class. I was considering not being an English major. I didn't like reading anymore. I didn't swear it off, but I thought it was futile. I felt numb when I read a lot of the times. I'm actually getting a little bit emotional talking about this. College was when I lost so much of my identity. So much of my identity as a kid came from where I'm from and books and writing, and I couldn't consume anymore. After all the hate crimes and all of the pandemic news, I felt numb to language. It was one of the most frightening things. I stopped writing, and then I started writing so much. I would write in my journal for around 5 to 6 hours a day maybe. And I remember the first thing that my teacher said about Paradise Lost. It was that Paradise Lost isn't a book, it is a guidebook for how to get out of depression, and what would cause more depression than the fall of mankind. I didn't necessarily agree. I mean, I did agree, but I was still numb. It was the first time that I found my community not in the book, but in the discussions around the book, and in authorship as opposed to story, or just how authorship is the story almost. And for this book specifically, I never felt more in tune with what was happening, because this is Mary Shelley's story about being a creator, creationism, and so was sort of Paradise Lost. It was written during the scientific revolution, and all of my papers, they didn't even focus on books sometimes, and sometimes I get docked off for that. I wanted to know what kind of culture produced books, how it was possible right here, right now, during a pandemic, to produce for anything to have merit, because it felt like my notion of the world was constantly being challenged, deconstructed, and proven false. And I felt very young, I felt very alone. Because I was creating out of this frenzy, really resonated with this story of creationism and the dangers of it, with mankind being awful, with judging people based on the way that they look. And maybe that's a simple concept, but I definitely felt like in our society there was just so many flaws, and I think this book really hits at some of the fundamental flaws of how we delineate human from beast, and how we can take responsibility and how we refuse to take responsibility. I understood, what it was to point fingers at other people and have to sit with who you are, what you made, and what your life has become. That was this book for me, and it really helped me because though all 3 books were very dark and sad, I had never been in a room where books were celebrated like that in my entire life. I'm getting very emotional. See, I love books. I grew up either with people who didn't read, or at a school where I felt like it wasn't cool to read. I felt almost ashamed of how I relied on books. I will admit, I was so out of it, I didn't do some of the readings. It was the first time in my life, but it was also the first time in my life that I had seen everyone else do the readings and everyone else do the secondary readings. Even though I was kind of slacking, it really reinvigorated this sense that books matter. They matter to people, and they can matter to me. Before I chronicled the lonesomeness I felt in reading, problems I found in the communities around reading, primarily some of the teachings. I think I just got lucky because I got put with people who were so careful and meticulous, never just spoke for participation points. And it was the first time I almost lost myself when speaking. And it was also the first time I was rewarded for speaking, for disagreeing. And it was great, and I loved it. I still keep in touch with that professor. I made some of my best friends in that class, my favorite class I've ever taken at Columbia. So that's this book for you. This is another book along a similar line. This is Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. There's this term in political science called constructivism. It's basically that culture influences how we think and is actually the agent for political good or bad or change. And I realized that what has a better hold on who we are, what we know, and what we believe than the way that we are educated. And so our first exposure to so many different things is on someone else's terms. Our introduction to slavery, our introduction to the Holocaust. At Shabbat, which is a Jewish gathering that I went to with a friend, they said that the person who is most widely read among the public education system, Elif Wiesel, but he exercises a lot of power within the community, and he has a monopoly over the teaching of Jewish and Holocaust education. And I went to my English teacher, and she told me to read Primo Levi and Hannah Arendt. And it was very interesting because I can see why this isn't taught in public education system. Hannah Arendt is taught in the political philosophy class that I took, but they aren't black and white. And I think as a kid, it makes sense that we have to read books that present a fairly black and white image. We are young and we're learning history, and wrong and right has to be delineated, and it is. And with something like the Holocaust, it's so personal, and so it's almost like you can't mess this up because it's the future that's at stake. But this book really challenged me. It made me see an account of Auschwitz that felt more real because it wasn't just Nazis are bad, I want to leave, this is horrible. It was that, but there was so many complex layers to it. The emotions that he felt weren't homogenous. They were very different and at times contradictory. His relationship with how he got out of the camp, the amount of selfishness and elite education as a chemist that afforded him the opportunity to not have to do physical labor. He has a weird relationship with how he succeeded. And he has also a strange relationship with meeting other survivors, with even talking about and re-experiencing his grief. In that way, it felt more real and it felt more heartbreaking. This, to me, was a practice of him exercising trust with the reader, letting them into the internal thoughts that are the most intimate and the most scary and the ones that he could so easily deny. And it did feel like education on my own terms, because when we came across German philosophy and Jewish thought in school, both in high school and college, sometimes they felt like there was something missing, and there was also a deep curiosity that I held after. And reading this was the first time that I willingly embarked on learning history for myself. That's not something I normally do. And I have a lot of love for this book, and I want to read a lot more Primo Levi. It was very life-changing. It's also a signal of the wide range that literature can cover, because this felt written for me, written for him, written for everyone who died. It felt like a very well thought out book. The final book that I will talk about is Elif Batuman's The Iliad, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I talked about it in my summer reading a book a week challenge. When I talked about it in that video, and I think you're curious about it from a more objective lens, you can watch that video, but even in that video, I was sort of tying it back to myself. And I think that is a great book. And in a similar way to Hanif Abdurraqib, it taught me a lot about what it means to be an exemplary contemporary author, specifically in the way that he's talking about very mundane, commonplace, cultural references. She's just talking about her college experience, and in an interview she says that at the time that this was published, she didn't feel that creative nonfiction was as big of a genre or as marketable as a genre as it is now, so she felt like she had to market it as fiction, even though it was highly taken from her own life. And it was another book that taught me the life that I'm living can be a book. It doesn't have to follow all of the arcs of what a story is, because what a story is can be extremely internal. A lot of this is just the character Celine's thoughts. And an academic journey is a personal journey, and a personal journey is an academic journey. When you go to college, how much of you changes and how much of you will always be the same. And in a way that as a child, I talk about sometimes disagreeing with literature, but feeling like within culture or just being a kid and, this book is deemed a classic, feeling like you can't rebel, but wanting to rebel in a very rational way. Not necessarily like this is a bad book. Being able to rebel and say this book isn't for me, or I don't enjoy this, or I don't resonate with this. And that's what this book is about. It's about being exposed to different concepts, different thoughts, and choosing what you believe in. It's also about something that I thought a lot about in college when I was learning Chinese. I've actually taken more credits of Chinese than I have English. I have taken 4 semesters of Chinese, or 20 credits, and the English major is only 32 credits. In Chinese, as an English major, it's always very interesting. I love thinking about how the sequence of which we learn words, how sentences are constructed, what we place as important, and why we're learning the word globalization before we're learning the word couch in Chinese, and what does that say about Columbia as an institution. The main character, her name is Celine, and she goes to Harvard, and she has similar thoughts surrounding going to college. She talks a lot about this book that she reads in her Russian class, and sort of the development of her language along with the development of the story. What can be afforded to a story the more you learn, and the more linguistic nuance there is. And how much language determines what we see, what we feel, what we're able to say and express ourselves. And it reminds me of something I learned in psychology class, which is that in Finland, they don't have a future tense. So it felt very constricted almost, confined to, in a similar way, that story is confined by language, what confines this book? So those are my 10 most influential books. I'm gonna make a lot more book content. I'm also traveling to Oxford very soon. I will be studying English literature there, something I'm not very used to 1550 to 1660 British literature. There are plenty of books that I read that I know are personal to a friend or a family member that I don't feel at that level. So I think this, less than being a recommendation book, it's more get to know me through the books that I read. And I also think that it's a huge testament to how time and life experiences factor into our experience of books. So yeah, and then if you have any questions or comments about what I said during this video, or you just wanted to leave me a comment, please type one down below. I try to respond to all of my comments.